Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome us to Panel 5, Intellectual Property Rights and the AfCFTA. We have two brilliant papers today.
Please let's settle in. The other session has started. Please.
The first is by an early career researcher, Kanyiri, and he's talking about geographical indications, decanting Muratina into the reality of the AfCFTA. And his abstract reminds me of our fireside chat in the last AfIELN conference where we had a local drink called ogogoro from Nigeria, and there were conversations about the making of ogogoro and building the value chain. And today we are going to be hearing about another drink that is native to East Africa and would explore the potential of having that protected as a geographical indication. And our second paper is by Dr. Uche Ngwaba, and is going to be considering one of the contemporary issues that we've had on following from the COVID-19 pandemic. And his paper is titled Taking Stock and Looking Ahead, Intellectual Property Rights for Catalyzing Regional Health Cooperation under the AfCFTA. Our speakers would speak for 10 minutes each and would have some time for robust conversations after. So the floor is yours, Kanyuri.
Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to tell you a story in three parts. The first part is about colonization. The second part is about governance and constitutional petitions. And the third part is about geographical indications and the potential to preserve African cultures and to unwrite colonial attitudes. Now, for the first part, East Africa was colonized by the English. And as their incursion led into East Africa, they came across a community in central Kenya called the Kikuyu. Now, the Kikuyu had already cultural habits and nuances that are with regard to drinking. And the drink of my people is named Muratina, or honey wine. Honey wine was used as the lifeblood of the community, not necessarily because of how it was taken, but rather because it marked almost each and every important ceremony in the community. Births, deaths, initiation, and marriage. Muratina was not brewed just for the sake of brewing, and neither was it purely for commercial purposes, because there was literally no African community that produced alcohol on that scale for rent or for rental purposes. Now, with the incursion of the British, there came with it two or three different attitudes. The first attitude was a disdain for the local customs, one of which was the local drink. And this is across most African states. And I can say this because having read Chinua Achebe's trilogy, in the second book, Arrow of God, there are two colonials who speak of palm wine being distasteful. And in East Africa, Muratina as well led to them thinking that these locals cannot handle the alcohol. What followed was a very interesting thing. They noticed that by destroying the cultural significance, they were able to subdue the people further. One, by introducing wage labor. When you introduce wage labor, something happens. The young men are taken away from the community and are now given jobs. What the jobs do, they give them the ability of purchasing power. Purchasing power means that the right or the significance that was held with the drinking of Muratina no longer holds significance because now it can be purchased or made cheaply. And this continued by 1907, the first enactment of intoxicating substances made by locals to curb the use and the drinking of Muratina. Post World War I, the attitudes became even stricter, and the colonial administration would attribute any insurrection to drunkenness of the youth. And the reports, even then, from an area called Thika, the police post, could not actually direct that the actions were because of the drinking. There were failures due to the colonial administration that they wanted to attribute to young men with the capability of rising up to the colonial government. Now, these attitudes are very interesting because we were colonized by the English, who had Victorian, almost, I'd say, Puritan attitudes towards alcohol. They could not tell the difference between alcoholism, alcohol consumption, or being drunk. And that same Puritanism is ironic because Kenya is famous for what was called Happy Valley. Now, anyone who's heard of Happy Valley is that the settlers were such revelers and would consume alcohol and drugs on such a scale. And they did not find this strange that while imports for consumption by settlers was on the rise, they would ban the preparation and the drinking by the locals. And this attitude was taken all the way until independence and adopted by the elites who preserved for themselves the right to sell and consume as opposed to their fellow citizens. 60 years down the line, the narrative continued about drinking and rowdiness in central Kenya as a problem. This narrative has been going on for 100 years, by the way. And a report that was done in 2022 by NACADA that basically stated that only 3.1% of alcohol consumed is traditional brews, which have been bunched in with illicit brews in a crackdown by the government. Now, where does the ray of light come in? This is the second part, the second act of my story. In 2023, the Ndeya Traditional Brewers Society filed a petition in the Kiambu court as a violation of their constitutional rights by the Inspector General of Police and the National Police Service. Interesting is they framed their arguments to the extent whereby that the National Police Service were curtailing their cultural rights, which are embedded in the Constitution. 1 in the preamble, 2 in Article 11, and 3 in Article 44 of the Constitution. In her analysis, Judge Abigail Mshila rightly put it that, and I'll read verbatim, the respondents were wrong in treating Moratina as illicit brew. Actions taken by the respondents against the petitioners for the sole reason that the petitioners are brewing Moratina lack legal basis and hence unconstitutional. Unless the respondent enforce specific provisions of the Alcoholic Drinks Control Act or any other law, they cannot raid homes, confiscate property, and prefer unfounded charges against authorized Moratina brewers. Those actions violate the cultural rights of the Agikuyu people. Which brings us to the third part of this act. The protection of traditional brews in Kenya sits squarely in a lacuna between expression of culture and a silence with regard to brews. That gives us one offshoot. Because it is an expression of culture, why then can we not situate traditional brews within the rubric of geographical indicators, within the African Continental Free Trade Area Protocol intellectual property rights? The term geographical indicator is a creature of the legal mind. However, it is not something recent. History is riddled with stories of trade and expansion, some in more noble things, such as Indian spice, and some ignoble, the Negro from the Gold Coast of Africa. That is still a geographical indicator because it speaks to the specific character of origin, what the French law of appellation called terroir. Basically, dis-moi ce que tu manges, je te dirai ce que tu es. Tell me what you eat, and I will tell you who you are. A few hours from here, we will be at the gala. And some of you will be evoked. Yeah, it will be. Yes, there'll be the evocative feeling you get when you drink champagne, or exactly, or if this was in Europe, if that plate of cheese was brought to you, there's an evocative feeling. Why? Because these things are protected under geographical indications. I'll give you two examples. One is feta cheese. Feta cheese comes from Greece. And the making of feta cheese can be traced to 6,000 years ago. And there is a philosophy behind it. Two is Prosecco. The bubbly Prosecco can be dated back 2,000 years. So, where am I going with this? From a legal perspective, GIs are intellectual property rights, and there are sui generis systems of protecting such products. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area Protocol Intellectual Property Rights at Article 9 provides for the protection of GIs through a sui generis system. And this, actually, thanks to my moderator, I learned the reason why the sui generis system appeals so much to the African sense is because it is the same one that is used by the Europeans in the divide between the old world and the new world. The old world being considered that is steeped in history and culture, much the same as the African world is steeped in history and culture. Therefore, it is imperative for us to take a look at what makes us unique. And in the words of the proverbial, the oldest and most famous carpenter in the world, if we are able to put old wine in new wineskins, then the new wineskin would rather be a geographical indicator within the AfCFTA. Thank you.
Okay, so this is the beauty of intellectual property. We're able to straddle across different subject matters and just make a beautiful presentation. That's excellent. Thank you. Uche, 10 minutes.
All right. Hello, everyone. So my talk is drawn out of my research program on developing a regional health governance approach. Primarily, I'm a global health law scholar, and what I'm focused on in my research is really putting out an alternative narrative to the global governance architecture under the WHO system. And the narrative is simply that the current architecture under the WHO system is overburdened, underfunded, and is stuck in the politics of power of the big global powers that make that system unable to adequately protect us when it really matters during period of health crisis, as we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, broadly, in pushing forward this idea of a regional health governance approach, I'm currently working on a project around this in the context of the Inter-American system. But much of the learning from the Inter-American system has implications for the African human rights, for the African Union system. And so in pushing forward this idea of a regional health governance approach, the place of IP has featured in my contemplation of what it can do to catalyze regional health cooperation under the AfCFTA. And so the big idea from my presentation really is that while the promotion and protection of intellectual property rights are central to achieving the AfCFTA objectives, they can also serve as a springboard for much needed cooperation for the development of a regional health governance approach that strengthens health capabilities against future health threats. So I'll be speaking to this idea in three movements. First, I would ask the question, what have we learned from the pandemic about intellectual property rights? what do current actions of Western states portend for the future of health governance in Africa? And then looking ahead, how can the AfCFTA catalyze regional cooperation for health governance? Now, a bit of looking back here, what have we learned from the pandemic? In the pandemic, intellectual property rights were weaponized against developing states during a period of a global health crisis. I give you a number of examples to illustrate this point. First, vaccine supply contracts were negotiated with developing states on less favorable terms than what was negotiated with developed states, and this is a fact. Second, many developing states, especially Caribbean and small island states, were completely locked out of the vaccine supply market because they were considered not profitable enough by pharmaceutical companies. And so many of these companies simply would not enter into a contract to supply vaccines to them, simply because they don't have the market that is attractive to the pharmaceutical companies. Thirdly, Pfizer, BioNTech, Moderna were making a profit of $1,000 every second, while the world's poorest countries remained largely unvaccinated. This is according to an Oxfam press release in November 2021. This, to my mind, is intellectual property rights being weaponized against developing states. A second point is we cannot trust developed states to always act in solidarity for the common good of the global community during periods of global health crisis. We have very wonderful international human rights instruments, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Civil and Political Rights, and several other instruments protect, the right to health and other underlying determinants of health. But during the crisis, the norms grounded in these instruments were conveniently forgotten. Vaccine hoarding or vaccine nationalism or apartheid, as the WHO Director General wrongly mischaracterized it. I have an article where I wrote that calling it vaccine apartheid is essentially a mischaracterization, and that really it was not an accidental behavior. It was simply the global health governance framework functioning exactly the way it has been designed to function, which is essentially to protect the West from the rest. One of the things I tell my global health laws class is, the first thing I tell them is that global health law is deeply colonial. It is steeped in coloniality. It started out as tropical medicine. Tropical medicine is euphemism for protecting the white colonizers from the diseases of the tropics. So that is the origin of global health. It started from tropical medicine, went through a number of generations of change in nomenclature, and today it is global health. But deep down in its institutional design, it is not meant to protect everyone on equal terms. And that is why during the Ebola virus crisis we had on the continent, it took a white person contracting the disease and taking it down to Europe for the WHO to swing into action. But when 10,000 souls had been lost on the African continent, it was not yet a crisis of international concern. So, the second point that I point to show that we cannot trust the West is the TRIPS waiver crisis. Many of you, if you had been following this, you would have, of course, been aware of India and South Africa's pitch to the WTO for waivers to the COVID vaccine so that generic versions could be produced. And it took until the twilight of the pandemic for some sort of consensus that was far below what was being requested to be reached. Now, the third point is that even when we have survived one of the worst global health crises in recent history, we cannot trust that the lessons that have been learned would not be so soon forgotten. We have the pandemic treaty negotiation process that could not be concluded at the 77th World Health Assembly meeting in June because of an impasse between the Global North and the Global South over access and benefit sharing. Global South states are simply saying that if you want access to pathogens and genomes from which you can conduct your research to produce vaccines, you have to give us a percentage from the produce of the vaccines. That is simply what they're asking for. And the big pharmaceutical companies in the West say, no, that does not work for us. So that is the sticking point in the negotiation. That is why the pandemic treaty did not pass, amongst other things. Secondly, at the beginning of the negotiation process of the pandemic treaty, there was a lot of enthusiasm around how the treaty would become a place to infuse equity into global health governance. But then, by the time the zero draft was reached, there was significant weakening of the language of equity in the provisions of the pandemic treaty. The deadlock in the pandemic treaty negotiation touched on issues of equity. While member states agree on many items in the treaty's draft, they could not reach consensus on some key topics, among them the sharing of samples and genomic sequences of pathogens that could cause a pandemic. So, what do current actions of Western states portend for the future of health governance in Africa? Well, the future doesn't look too promising for global health governance on account of the following concerns. The first is the ideological differences between the global north and the global south that have led to difficulty in achieving consensus on key issues around IP, trade, and tech transfer in ongoing pandemic treaty negotiations. Secondly, there is no guarantee that when the next pandemic happens, the pandemic treaty instrument, if and when eventually it is adopted, will have much impact on states' behavior. A recent study published by some colleagues at the Global Strategy Lab of York University in Canada has raised doubts about the efficacy of international treaties in fostering global cooperation. So, all of this leads me to suggest that regional systems and initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Agreement remain critical junctures to interrogate a path forward for developing and strengthening health capabilities in the complex vaccine manufacturing ecosystem. African states can no longer rely on the goodwill of the West to address its health challenges. The Good West is the longest running scam in history. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement offers a wonderful opportunity to reimagine the African approach, to reimagine Africa's approach to IP and trade in health goods and services. The WTO system was not designed to be emancipatory for non-Western states, unless you are a China who can outwit the West at their own game. And so, the third point is looking ahead. How can the AfCFTA catalyze regional cooperation for health governance? I have a number of suggestions here that this instrument can be a springboard for regional cooperation for health governance. The emphasis here is on regional cooperation. In particular, the instrument that has now emerged from the phase 2 negotiations can energize cooperation in the following specific areas. The research and development ecosystem for medicines and vaccines on the continent needs to be energized. It has to encourage private and public sector investments in African-driven hubs for manufacture of medicines, vaccines, and medical products. The African continent should become a major hub for producing medicines and vaccines. It should encourage innovation in the health landscape of the continent, tapping into indigenous potentials and resources like the traditional knowledge system that abound all around the continent. And my last slide, it should ensure that a process of institutional coordination is put in place so that the protocol on intellectual property rights, investment, and competition policy complements the important work being done by the African CDC, which has as its aim strengthening the capacity and capability of Africa's public health institutions as well as partnerships to detect and respond quickly and effectively to diseases and threats and outbreaks. Any future regional health governance framework that aims to succeed must find ways to avoid the current absurdity in the global system where the WHO and the WTO systems are not in conversation with each other, despite the significant impacts that events occurring in each of these domains can have on the other. So, if you look at the example of the COVID-19 vaccine, the nationalism and apartheid debacle, where the WHO had no say in how the demands for waivers for the TRIPS regime would be resolved at the WTO system, despite the impact that decision was going to have on WHO's role in global health governance, you can see that that is a dysfunction that a regional health governance system in the African continent needs to avoid. I'll stop here.
Brilliant. So we've gone from local brews to health. And and that's the world of IP. Some keywords that I would draw from both presentations: colonial foregrounds and continuities, politics, power, hypocrisy, the hypocrisy of intellectual property, the interest-driven nature of intellectual property rights. On the one hand, when there are circumstances that could be beneficial to both parties or to one party because it's interest driven, the global north will seek solidarity with the global south. So in the instance of geographical indications, because the global south have strong types of products that are steeped in culture, steeped in tradition, the global north seeks alliance with the global south to push for stronger geographical indication systems. And there you see a divergence, or you see a difference within the global north. So for geographical indications, you see a situation where Europe has a different position from the US. So the US, and that's the analogy of old world, new world. The US would be classified as a new world jurisdiction, where you have traditions that do not produce as many types of products that could have geographical indications. So they say, why do we really need a sui generis system? Why do we really need a special or unique system? Why can't we just protect this product as a trademark? Right? So you're seeing a situation where you're saying, let's open up the intellectual property space and let's just have, the normal type of protection that we could have for a product that is associated with a particular owner, right? So let's just have a trademark. But then when we go to health, then they say, oh no, actually it's very important for us to have strong protection for pharmaceutical patents because of the amount of investment, because of the research and development, because you have to recoup all of the investment in producing those drugs. So let's push for the strongest type of intellectual property rights that we can have. And here you have an alliance where the global north, for example, you have the Quad, you have the US, you have the EU, you have Canada, you have Japan saying, let's push for the stronger system. And here, Africa, Asia, that were the allies for geographical indications. At this point, you're not allies anymore because we don't have that much interest because we are the market, right? And they say, let us have stronger intellectual property rights. That's the hypocrisy. That's the interest-driven nature of intellectual property rights, and that's where you see the politics at play in intellectual property rights. But I'm not going to talk a lot. There is a red cap chief. I think the only red cap chief in this room that has fundamental knowledge on both. So from the perspective, not just drinking the local brews, but understanding the politics of the institutionalization of illicit gins across the continent and local brews, and also the literature, right? So the work of Chinua Achebe, for example, they're from the part of Nigeria. So I'll just prepare him for comments, and also comments around public health, global public health, and conversations about human rights and solidarity, international solidarity. So, he did excellent work as the United Nations Social Rapporteur on that. And so I'll just prepare you to give a comment, but I'll open up the floor now, and then I'll take a comment from you. But let me open up the floor. Start with somebody, and then I'll come to you next. So, questions, comments? Okay, so we'll do female, male. So do you want to start first? Okay, so 1, 2, then Professor. No, sorry. She would start, then Professor Kafo would go next, then Professor Gatti. He's Kikuyu, so I think he's also vested in this. So Professor Gatti is third. Who is the next? Who
Who's
else?
first? Okay.
She's the first. Yeah.
I was trying not to be first because I'm going to go quite off topic. Hopefully, I'm not. But I wanted to ask Uche, in terms of just you're speaking about um, the pandemic, which still triggers me very much. But like in terms of the vaccines, there was a lot of vaccine discrimination that was also happening a lot here in Africa in terms of which vaccine to go for, and the fact that it came from this certain place in America or wherever, then it really must be strong in terms of going for the Pfizer instead of the one that came from China, etc., etc. So as much as we don't then trust the West in terms of that as well, how can Africa also maintain that of trust in terms of, let's say they come up with their own vaccine, so culture that trust as well in Africa to say this is a solution to this problem or this pandemic that we're going to face, and just really how to navigate that of the vaccine discrimination.
Uh, Thanks, Madam President, for putting me on the spot in more than one sense. But happy to comment. I won't say too much. You've already mentioned that I did some work on this type of vaccine nationalism and all that before I retired from that position recently. And essentially, I agree, with those positions. So rather than recounting what I agree with, which you've all heard just now, I was thinking about what brings them together. Right? One is global health, and one is IP, albeit geographical indications, and because both sounded pretty much the same. I mean, the particular subject matter is different to me, right? And I think two things, one of which has been mentioned already, racial capitalism, sort of the continuities, amidst some discontinuity of racial capitalism and power asymmetries, right? How power asymmetries and racial capital has defined and continues, more importantly, to produce all these outcomes, right? So essentially, what we have had for 60, 70 years is rearrangement of the furniture in the room, more or less. Once in a while, a minor piece of furniture is removed, something else is added, but it's just a rearrangement. There's not been a fundamental rejigging or restructuring, right? I think Professor Gathi, other people are pointing out, illustrating IMF, voting. So what you continue to see is that. And for me, uh, in the absence, because not power, ideas do not float freely, right? They never, it's not just like we can, resist and go into the streets and all of a sudden, the world changes, right? It doesn't float freely. Power shapes, right, and produces. It's like a Netflix production. I don't want to say with benefits and consequences, but it's a Netflix production. So these things are produced by power. No, whether it's geographical indications, if you come to human rights, the exact same story. You go to global health, it's the same story, right? So for me, we have to pay more attention. Not that we don't do, we have to pay more attention to, as Africans, to the intervention points, right? At what intervention point should we focus? And for me, and with what equipment, with what repertoire, right? And for me, unless we get at that fundamental power asymmetry, where the story will keep reproducing, right? It doesn't matter almost, what it is, even the local or the global, right? Which we've heard about for the first panel as well. And so I just gave a paper in January at Leiden University, the Owada lecture, where even the Japanese feel squeezed, as powerful as they are, by the ongoing great power rivalry between China and the US. And many, I think, on the continent have been conditioned to look at China's great rise as a threat. I would argue against that. It's neither a threat nor a benefit. It's an opportunity because it is not whether it will, it is reshaping the power calculus. So as Africans, what we should concentrate on is what spaces can that produce for us, right? It's not about aligning one way or the other. It's about what spaces are thus produced and how can we mobilize and leverage those spaces, right? So that's what I'll just add to the conversation, other than ending by assuring Kanyiri that other than palm wine, I will definitely decant more of Muratina in the future.
So, Professor Gatti, then we have Professor Milej, then we have Dr. Duam.
So, great papers. I don't know why the AFCFTA had to hire white people to go and do the. I digress. So, Kenyere, we are going to welcome that red hat chief to get some Moratina soon. I mean, your paper is great. And I'm very delighted you're reading Professor Titilayo Adebola's work. My suggestion to you is to consider using this as an entry point to doing the work that she has been championing, which is to center Africa's innovative and creative strengths. So you're talking only about GIs now, but Moratina is sort of, you could think of all the other things that Moratina requires. So traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expressions. So when that red hat cap chief comes, he's not gonna drink Moratina the same way he drinks palm wine. And so on and so forth. So I think plant variety protection, I think I've already said traditional knowledge and traditional cultural expressions. And her article, in which I have said before, referred to before, mapping Africa's complex regimes in the first issue of the African Journal of International Law, is a really good roadmap. So I'd encourage you to expand. I think we should have more people like you, sort of not centering the same things, trademarks and all the other things that are used to squeeze into our markets, global products. So I would encourage you to think more expansively, sort of to be more ambitious in what you're doing. And for Uche, I wonder, in Addis, there's so much energy around the African Medicines Agency as the solution for all the things that you were saying. So I wonder whether you have looked at that, because, I have my own views. I won't say what they are, but the African Medicines Agency, which was designed in the middle of the pandemic, was to respond precisely to what you don't want to call vaccine apartheid. And I think if you have not engaged with it, I know you had limited time, it would be great that it's part of this paper, because I think the African Union would say, oh, but we are doing all of this. Look at the African Medicines Agency. So I think for your paper to have a complete account of what's going on, I think you'd have to engage that and tell us whether or not it meets your criteria for what should happen. Thank you.
Thank you. This was really interesting. I will definitely try the local brew, Muratina. We have a similar one, but we call it mess. So Muratina and mess, maybe we can exchange recipes one day. So my question is, like, if that knowledge of how to make it is shared among communities that go beyond one ethnicity or beyond the geography of a certain country, that is something maybe you can consider as a question or comment and think about it and maybe share your thoughts. Um, and then just looking at TRIPS, Article 15 Sub 4, and the negotiations that went around it, and why India pushed for Article 15 Sub 4, which could be interpreted to protect traditional knowledge. That was the main reason India was pushing for that sub-article, and just delving into the meaning of of these words that were used in the TRIPS, and how the negotiations went could be a possible avenue to push back to the Eurocentric conceptions of geographic indicators or public health as well for Uche. It seems to me also maybe if you can trace the language likewise in the AFCFTA, if you are lucky enough to get the negotiations and the points of discussion, which if you do, please share them with everyone, not just me. I will, yeah, these are just thoughts and comments I had, but excellent work, and I look forward to reading the papers.
Thank you so much. I would like to ask about the health policy. I think it's a very inspiring thing to talk about. I will be talking tomorrow about investment policy, which is not there. Yeah? AFCFTA is not about common policies. There's not much about health policy, not much about investment policy, and I don't know, educational policy, common policy. Not much about that. So it's like we are reproducing a script, a prescription for economic well-being developed by a Hungarian-American economist, Bela Balassa. So we have a free trade area, then free movement of services, capital. Then we back it up with rules on IP, rules on competition, so that the trade works, yeah, and we will be fine. Yeah? Well, maybe we'll be, maybe we will not. Yeah? But is it the right thing to do? Should AFCFTA be also more about crafting common policies and having institutions that would help to come up with these policies, would take some leading role in negotiations or provide for impulses and oversee implementation? Or we just leave it to African Union? Yeah, that's what your presentation made me think about. Thank you.
Okay. My question is on the health policy. It's reminded me of something I was thinking about some months back, and now it's aside from the commodity pharmaceuticals. Let me just read my title, which was my largest research question out loud. How do we ensure equitable enforcement of non-pharmaceutical interventions during pandemics in sub-Saharan Africa? And as you were talking, I realized the questions tie in, and it ties in sort of as well into what Professor Thomas was saying. Looking aside from the commodities as well, with trade and services, then that gives us an avenue for a harmonization of standards somewhat. And if you look at non-pharmaceutical interventions, that's all they are, standards enforced by the state, but the state doesn't know anything about public health. So can the African Continental Free Trade Area also serve as an avenue for an updating of standards on dealing with non-pharmaceutical interventions in pandemics and public health crises? Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Ute. Your presentation has reminded me of something Dr. Ngozi said during the pandemic. She said that we need to build back better, essentially restructure the system that is currently there, where majority of the value chain of vaccines is outside Africa, over 90%. And you've alluded to the same, where you're saying where we need to build African innovation hubs to create value chain systems in the continent. But now my question comes, my background is in tech. And when you look at financing, for instance, in tech and startups, less than 2% of money comes to African startups, less than 2%. So you look at R&D, it's also equally expensive. So, okay, fine, we use the AFCFT as a jumping point, but then how do we make this practical? How do we actually make this practical that can create these African hubs and they actually work and we create a value chain system in the continent?
Thank you very much for all the brilliant questions. We'll start with health and then we'll end on a positive note to lead us into the gala. So we'll do 4 minutes each.
Okay. Okay, quite a fair bit. Thank you very much for all the wonderful questions and comments. I'll start with the first question. Sorry, I didn't catch your name. Barbara? Yes. So your question was about vaccine discrimination in Africa and which vaccine to go for. You're quite right about that. And I think it reminds me of what happened with an African indigenous pharmaceutical company, AsPen, who produced a vaccine that was never sold, and on account of this very same issue of discrimination. I think the major problem has to do with, and this is where the governance factor comes into play. A major part of it has to do with what role the state plays and the key actors who are responsible for driving health policy, what role they play in essentially presenting these products to the populace. During the pandemic, there was a lot of misinformation and disinformation that was going around about the vaccines. Religious leaders, political actors, people with an axe to grind, they all had their theories. And the public was being fed a steady diet of these theories. And so this affected people's perception about the vaccines. In health governance and health policy systems, there are specific areas of health governance that deal with how information is passed to the public about public health goals. Health education is critical for doing that kind of work. So I think that a more sort of organized governance apparatus would be able to avoid these issues of vaccine discrimination. And again, the other thing again is that if you take the front foot, then you control the narrative. If you take the back foot, then you are hostage to the narrative. Thank you for your comments, Professor Okafo, about racial capitalism. It's well taken. Professor Gati, thank you also for your comments about engaging with the African medicines agencies. I will do that as I develop this work further. Professor Thomas, your question about health policy, whether we are reproducing a script for economic well-being produced by Western thinkers in health and trade, I agree with you. That is the very essence of the critique around the current structure we have on the continent. And hence, the work I do, even in the context of pushing for a regional health governance approach, is situated within the context of decolonial discourse. I say we are decolonizing health governance because the current framework was not designed to take our interests first. So someone asked, how do we ensure equitable enforcement of non-pharmaceutical interventions in sub-Saharan Africa? Can the AfCFTA be a venue for such an enforcement? Yes, it can. Health is such a complex discourse, that requires pretty much every other disciplinary context having a say in its objectives. So there is much room for that to happen. And let me quickly round up with how do we restructure the system and its value chain. I agree with the case for an African innovation hub, and I agree that financing is a problem. But then here's the thing. Financing for health, how much of our government's GDP is actually spent on health? How much of our budgetary allocations are we really maximizing the resources of the state in the area of health? What about the private sector? Are they really investing in the health system? So these are questions that we can interrogate further. Thank you.
Okay, I've been given 4 minutes. I'll start with Professor Kapu. Yes, I completely and totally agree with you that there's always that racial element towards this. But in terms of the production process or the asymmetry with regard to sometimes the chairs are shifting, in the situation where we are trying to bring out what is uniquely African and to shed off that colonial attitude that we also look at our own products with, I'm not sure how, but maybe I can ask you later, we can take up the power and open the space. Because that speaks to what Carl Schmitt used to call the nomos of the earth. The ordering based on the dominant power at that time. And it is also the same dominant power that decided what kind of international laws was ruling then. If the nomos that is going to be opening up now is by the Chinese, does that mean we realign ourselves and be the joyriders of that power such that we can put a literal stamp on our own geographical indicators? And then for Professor Gati, I appreciate the endorsement, and we will definitely be looking towards opening up this space to doing this kind of work. And finally, Professor Loam, I also struggled to find the actual document for the protocol. I think this is something we can both work towards, especially if there's a travaux préparatoire where we can look at how the negotiation was done to arrive at particular articles. And for that, I'll be looking for you later. And thank you for your time, and enjoy your evening, ladies and gentlemen.
What did you say? Okay, so I'll thank our panelists for, I think, those thought-provoking discussions and for raising important issues that could contribute to actually economic development in terms of health, because we need health to be well and to work, and then to contributing to trade, right? Increase trade, because those are, if we have local brews that could be exported, we could contribute to sustainable endogenous development through the protection of those as geographical indications. So I think these are crucial topics for international economic law from African perspectives. And I'd like to thank us all. We now have some time, for a short break as we end our day, and then would reconvene at 6:30 by the beachfront for our gala night. Thank you.